Welcome back. We're going to start a new unit today, and this is going to be look at really two different things. One is looking at the school environment for adolescents, and the other one is going to look at some of the school problems related to adolescence, so dropouts, bullying, things of that sort. In this first video lecture, we're going to mostly look at how school has changed over time, and look at some efforts to reform and change the school and how they approach the education and the socialization of adolescents. And we're going to look a little bit at other countries and just see for some cross-national comparisons other schools and educational institutions deal with adolescents. So the first thing we're going to look at is how the role of school has changed over time. Second, we're going to look at how American schools compare to other nations and cultures, particularly Germany and Japan and Russia. And lastly, we're going to look at how societies try to reform their education systems. And particularly starting in the 1970s, there's been wave after wave of educational reform, mostly based on a critique of what they consider conventional education, but partly reflecting kind of the changing priorities and their changing, let's say, purposes that schools have been put to, and how this has impacted adolescents. So let's look at a quick overview of the history of education in the United States. Before 1890, schooling was not considered, it wasn't really public education, it wasn't really mass education. What education was for, at least at the age we're talking about adolescence, which means middle school through high school and college, was relatively rare. You had some, reading, writing, arithmetic. You had some day schools, one-room classrooms, but they're mostly focused on the lower grades and getting to a basic of literacy and numeracy. They weren't really teaching the types of subjects that we learn in high school. The mentality was that schooling was something for elites, and in addition to just, let's say, being functional and having general knowledge of certain subjects, it was mostly about having the refinement to operate in elite society. And so two words that can describe this. The first one is a classical education, which meant that if you were in high school in the 1800s, mostly what you learned was reading classics books, meaning Greek and Latin text, learning to translate from Greek and Latin, and also reading some, let's say, you could say big famous books on history, philosophy, and things of that sort. And that was considered, and particularly I should say this is mostly a male education at this time as well, because these were considered, let's say, the training of a gentleman. The second thing that it was mostly a liberal education, and liberal education here does not mean liberal like left or right politically. Liberal means one that is based on kind of humanities, focused on writing, focused on things like poetry, literature, etc., as opposed to scientific and technical training. So the typical person in high school would not have gotten as much background in things that got their hands dirty, in, let's say, applied science. You didn't really have anything that was really technical because it was kind of felt that those manual trades and those kind of like the physical world was something that coarsened, let's say, someone. And for someone that was already born into wealth and expected to be an elite of their society, it wasn't so important for them to have that kind of practical knowledge. And that more or less continued in this country through most of the 1800s. And if you look at some of the early colleges that were around at this time, it was more about, social rank, meaning like where your family came from, than about education. So in the early years of Harvard University, you weren't ranked by your GPA, your grades in school. You were ranked by kind of your social standing of your family. So starting in the late 1800s, probably even a little earlier than 1890, but continuing until about World War I, you had the progressive movement, and you had a lot of changes that, really two changes that changed how education was going, particularly for adolescents, which means there was K through 8 schools pretty much throughout the country already. You had waves of public education in the 1840s and then shortly after the Civil War, but you didn't have really education starting from what we might say 7th, 8th grade through the college years, at least not broadly for the entire population. So progressive reforms created, particularly at the state level, banned child labor. So back then, child labor was common. It was often dangerous, and children started to work as young as 2nd and 3rd grade, sometimes even younger than that, because they had to earn enough money to help support their households. When the states passed laws that banned that, then the question became is what do you do with these children if they're not working? And partly with school was an answer like it was a kind of a daycare to look after children while their parents were earning a living. The second thing that happened is that you had compulsory school attendance, which means it wasn't simply just paid free tuition free, and sometimes you see things like free school district indicating that there was no tuition charged. I live near a place in Newburgh, and their school's called Newburgh Free Academy, and that free didn't mean that it didn't cost anything. The free meant that there wasn't tuition charged like most private schools at the time that we talked about before, about the elite training schools that existed. But they also required school attendance, which means that it wasn't just optional. It wasn't just in a sense free, it was something that they required to do. And a lot of this was, that attendance became very important. And without going too much into the detail, it's because it solves kind of the collective action problem with education, that is both a public good as well as a private good. But I'm not going to get too much into the economics, but that this was a big change in the sense that school attendance wasn't just like desirable, it was compulsory. So what happened kind of toward the end of the progressive period, the 1920s, you started going from changing from that classical liberal education that focused on the humanities, that focused on reading old books, that was mostly on elite preparation and a college preparation pathway, is that the progressive school basically saw education as part of a training in democracy. And so the whole idea of civics and preparing someone to participate fully in a democratic modern society was a big push at this time. But secondly, that school was more or less justified, not in terms of just democratic values and not just in terms of like social refinement, but in training someone and giving them work skills. Now, you might think, well, that's obvious, but it wasn't obvious at the time, because the principal pathway by which you were supposed to get work skills prior to this was that you did what your parents did, and therefore, we talked about this before, that the family was the main educational institution, that you basically learned how to live your life and you gained skills at your parents' knee. On top of that, you used to have a master and apprentice system that if you were trained, your parents would, in a sense, sell you, or they would rent you out to a master and you would apprentice for them, and then eventually you would become a master and be able to form your own shop. So what happened is that there was huge changes in the curriculum of schools at this time. So first of all, they became much more comprehensive instead of the narrow kind of approach of classical and liberal education that predominated during the 1800s. But also you had a more applied curriculum, which means a lot more practical skills. So things like home economics, things like tech class. If you look in New York City, there were places where they taught sewing and cooking and things of that sort. You also started to see some of the first electives, which meant that previously everyone took the same classes and there was no like differentiation. Everyone read the same books, everyone was in the same classes. You had very little choice of subjects, and at this time you start to see the first electives. So you had a music class, an art class, physical education really started at this period, and also, well, things like, a health class. So today we have what you might call a very comprehensive approach, which is that schools are supposed to be all things for all people. And we'll talk more about this idea of the shopping mall concept of the school. And on top of that, not only is that, that schools are a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and not having a clear idea, so that, schools today don't justify themselves in preparing you for the workforce. They don't justify themselves in preparing you to be a citizen in democracy. They're not preparing you necessarily for entree to the elites. They're doing a little bit of everything. And the idea is that they're doing the same thing for everyone, but a little bit of everything without really kind of focusing on one main justification. The other thing that's very common about contemporary education is that education has become the easy way to solve all of society's problems, which means that issues from racism to gun violence to hunger to job skills to foreign policy. The one thing that almost every proposal to solve any of these problems is more education, more training. And as a result, people started to use schools not to simply educate, but also to kind of, in a sense, to address whatever their social policy concern is. And I don't mean just social policy in terms of helping out people disadvantaged or social welfare. I'm talking about any way that people wanted to change the world, the schools became the battleground. And this became particularly important with some of the debates over schools in history and science, where there were a lot of debates over what should be taught in the science class, meaning things like around evolution, but also what was taught in the history class, particularly contentious things about history. And you started to see different political pressure groups fight to put different conclusions into the official state curriculum. So more recently in the 70s and 80s, we've had waves upon waves of education reform. In the 1970s, there were several independent panels kind of saying what's wrong with our education system. It should be said that shortly before the 1970s, the United States was considered the model education system for the world. We certainly graduated more people from high school. It was about 80–90% in high school graduates in the United States, while most countries such as the United Kingdom, France, other developed countries were more like 60%. And we had broad-based literacy across the population. We had fewer people going to college than perhaps in some other countries. But the point is that we were the model. But in the 1970s, people started to question whether we were losing our edge and our education system was becoming a little bit tired. Now, there's some other things going on. So you have the civil rights movement and school integration going on at this period that was creating issues and pressures. You had a problem of like suburbanization, which meant that you had schools popping up in places where there wasn't large populations before, so you had newly built schools. And you also had the affluent society of the United States kind of changing what education meant to the broader society. But the studies of education during this period generally, and we talked about this before, we talked about adolescent society and the work of sociologist James Coleman, is that schools segregate adolescents into teenage warehouses, which means that, as we talked about in our unit on peers, teenagers spend most of their time with other teenagers, and unlike previously where they would have apprenticed or they would have worked with their parents, where teenagers had a lot of interaction with the adult world, you basically put them in a warehouse and adolescents were isolated from larger society and mostly interacting with other adolescents and therefore not getting, let's say, the tutelage from older people or in the guidance from, let's say, adult members of society. And I think there was also kind of a dissatisfaction that high school was too academic and not as much applied. And in some ways that high school had become a one-size-fits-all system, which was all preparation for college, partly driven by things like the GI Bill that opened up college to a much larger group of people than previously. But the idea is that not everyone was going to follow that path, and people were starting to think, are there alternatives to the standard American suburban American high school? And so you saw people create different programs, more hands-on programs, things that were kind of, let's say, outward bound, so things, a semester at sea, and different types of non-standard alternative high school or education programs. And to accommodate this, what you saw is that some schools lowered the age which you could drop out of school legally from 16 to 14. So in the 1970s, also in the United Kingdom, you saw this idea of open education approach, which means that instead of forcing everyone to follow the same path and to pass classes at the same time, it became much more about learning and developing at your own pace, meaning that like students learn at different speeds at different times, and therefore that the education system should be more flexible to accommodate this. And while this is a very good idea in general, and the idea of breaking down the conformity and breaking down some of the structures, if you are a fan of the music group Pink Floyd, the idea that education was, a form of authority that was being imposed upon individuals that was not necessarily fostering their potential. But unfortunately, I think this was influenced by a lot of some of the outlooks of the time of just letting kids do whatever they want and giving them way too much freedom. And in the few places where this was experimented with, it wasn't very implemented well, and it became tear down the walls, soon became a free-for-all. And, in some way that kind of gave this approach to education a bad name, the idea that it wasn't a good education model. And so despite the problems with the existing educational system, a lot of people didn't think an open education, kind of loosely structured education system was really an improvement. But it did lead to kind of like a backlash or kind of a counter movement to the 1970s with an emphasis you might call it back to basics or core education movements. And the idea is that schools needed to function on the rigorous training of intellectual skills, that they were not really teaching the basics, whether it was literacy or numeracy, that they weren't, the knowledge base of adolescents was much lower than previous generations, and therefore schools had to get back to their basics and focus on teaching the academic content of their subjects rather than, let's say, thinking about the whole child. So what this also included is that the idea that social development, the idea that what you learn in school is not simply mathematics, science, history, etc., but it was also kind of developing as a person, What you saw is that during the 1980s, this social development facet of education became less important or de-emphasized, and it felt it was kind of like a lot of social policy and getting away from the basics of what school is about, which is about learning things. And so what the Back to Basics movement led to a lot of pushes, led to a lot more homework, and several people have criticized that certainly current generation gets a lot more homework than previous generations. There's not necessarily a lot of evidence indicating that the amount of homework leads to more learning or leads to better academic results. You see a lot more emphasis on tests, which means as someone who's a little bit older, there's certainly a lot more tests given now than they would have given in the past. And even though people don't like to use the word test as much anymore, they would use word assessments, and they brought in their idea of how to assess children. There certainly is a lot more quantifying students' academic progress than they would have in the past. And you see this in terms of the rise of high stakes tests. Even though you had regions in New York State from going back to at least the 1930s and 40s in some subjects, the idea that people were being evaluated on the basis of their performance in these tests is a relatively new thing that I would say started in the late 80s and really through the 1990s. It also led to more emphasis on discipline, which means that people who were disrupting the classroom were not seen as being people who are nonconformist or had a different approach to education that need to be accommodated. They were seen as people who were being disruptive, and they needed to kind of be forced into an academic structure. And so you saw a lot more emphasis on everyone seated on a desk. Children should not be moving around the room. And so the idea that if children are out of their desk or chair, that this means that learning is not going on, and this became more criticized, while in the previous decade it was something that was encouraged. So this led to a lot more emphasis on direct instruction. You might call it teacher-centered educational model. And this really came from, what also kind of fueled the Back to Basics movements was the publication of several different studies looking at cross-national scores on math and science and reading, and seeing the United States, instead of getting the first place that it typically got in previous decades, had fallen into the mid or to the bottom of the developed countries, and therefore there was this fear that we were falling behind in science and we were falling behind in the Cold War, and we needed to get more serious about the academic content of education. And what's important about this is that there's nothing wrong with focusing on academics in isolation, but the point is that if it comes as a trade-off to social development, you might see some social problems not being addressed, leading to more social issues among students and adolescents of this age group. So I mentioned before about the idea of shopping mall high schools, and this idea is that in American high schools are very different in the sense they have a little bit of this, that it's a little bit like college in the terms that you choose your schedule, that there are a lot of different courses out there, not everyone is taking the same course, and the idea that you have a very diverse student body, you have a lot of different choice, which means you don't have to take the same class that everyone else is. And this is going to lead to more neutral, because the school is going to embrace or provide at least something for everyone that makes them happy. And this kind of grew a lot. And if you looked at, let's say, the curriculum of previous years, you just had English 9, English 10, English 11, English 12. It was more or less the same class and the same books, no matter who you were, whether you were an honors student, Regents student, etc. And so you see a lot more electives and kind of specialized classes today. So people were thinking this was a good thing because it stimulates choice, and I think Americans, with your emphasis on individualism and freedom, choice is a good thing. I think the problem with that is that very often students and even parents make choices in the dark. And as someone who teaches a lot of electives, it's often the case that students don't know what the course is. It's because it was recommended to them by a guidance counselor, or they knew the teacher already, or they liked the title of the course rather than whether the course fit them well. So the point is that most people, when they're adolescents, don't really know what their future is. They don't really know what skills they should or should not have. And so what happens is there are more guesses in the dark than main people who are more informed about what do I need to know. And I think what's different is in college you have a much more vocational orientation. People know what they want to study because they kind of know what they need to get to certain jobs or what credentials they need. and that's not necessarily true at the high school and during the high school years. So the idea is that high schools would embrace multiple values. They would offer a wide range of courses. There would be a lot of diversity. This would lead to a high school that was neutral, and this was very important given the previous issues with civil rights and ethnic diversity and segregation in schools. It was a way of making schools more welcoming. But it did raise a basic question: is the goal of schooling about the intellectual development of the child, which means the academics you learn, learning what is good for you, what adults know is necessary for your skill set to succeed in adult society, or should the school be focused on improving the social and emotional maturity of the students, which means, it's not as important to learn calculus or American history or government or biology as it is to grow as a person and to be comfortable with yourself during this period of great change. And what you saw with it is kind of a non-decision. They gave people a lot of choices, but maybe these were not as intellectually rigorous. It wasn't that everyone was learning the same thing, and so people kind of had a fracturing of knowledge. And I think also that there was a growth in maturity problems, mostly because there wasn't a unified message or a unified approach about what was desirable. How do you want adolescents to be mature? What was the model of an adult that you want to bring them to? And given that there was no social decision on what the purpose of education was, it made it harder for education to decide what education should be practically in terms of the curriculum of students. So let's look at some cross-national comparisons. Now, the idea that people are mandated to go to school and compulsory education and and that tuition-free education is pretty much standard in all the developed countries of the world. So most countries start school around the same time. In some parts of the United States, until recently, kindergarten was optional. Now what you're seeing is that preschool is optional, but preschool is widely availed by people who have the resources and funding, and that education more or less is required to something between the ages of 14 to 17 or middle adolescence. So in some countries it can be 14, other countries 17. Most will continue to around 18. In New York State, I believe that you are entitled to an education up to the age of 21 or 22, which means if you fail your subjects and you're unable to graduate, you are still entitled to a tuition-free education up to those years. And after that, there's other tracks that if you're unable to complete a high school education to prepare you for certain fields. So let's look at what's happened in some other schools. So in German schools, you basically have 3 educational tracks. You have one that is, I might call, let's say, standard education. It's the basics. It is not necessarily particularly challenging, but it covers, it's kind of maybe a watered down version of the basic skills you need to live in society, but not necessarily to the point where you're required to do the college level of these subjects. So the point is that there might be more focus on some things like business math and less things on calculus or trigonometry, which are mostly needed for preparation to go to higher levels of math. So that was kind of like a catch-all track. The second one is that you had a middle school that was more of an advanced education, that was more vocational training, and so you might be diverted into learning a trade, whether manufacturing or plumbing or things of that sort, but it would be a lot less academic. And then lastly, you would have an academic school, which was for students that are identified to be successful at the college level, and that looks more like, you might say, the AP/honors curriculum you would find in American high school. And the idea is that if you chose that track, it was because you wanted to go to college, and as a result, the classes were very rigorous, the classes were very hard, and there wasn't really an accommodation. And so the basic model in the United States is that everyone who can should go to college, even if you're not necessarily academically the best student. While the view in most other countries is the idea that college is a specialized thing for people who are ready to handle a certain level of work and have the aptitude and desire to learn these things, which means the idea is that what college is an independent standard, not something that adapts to kind of the larger public. And I think part of this is that there's a lot fewer private colleges in Europe and Japan, that most universities were formed by the national government, partly to develop skill sets in certain areas, and provide a domestic skill set for their country. And as a result, that you saw the nation decide what were the criteria and what were the important things to learn, and it wasn't so much like the student's choice. Another thing that you often see, and we talked about the liberal and classical education, and you still have this type of education in most European countries, or at least as a choice, where there's an emphasis on translations from Latin and Greek and reading classical texts written by famous and important Roman and Greek writers. One big thing is that you have very comprehensive exams, which means that it's likely that you have an exam that tests you on a broad range of subjects, and it is quite hard, significantly harder than the Regents exams that you would take in the United States at the end of a course. And they'd be more comprehensive, which means they wouldn't necessarily be focused on individual subjects. Russian schools, at least before the fall of communism, always had more of a vocational bent. The idea was to prepare students for work, and so you had pretty standard labor education programs as a subject, and these were basically vocational training and on-the-job experience. And so it was less academic and less liberal. It wasn't more about you learn something in the class and then you get tested on it. It was more like that you got trained in a variety of different skills, and there was more involvement of labor unions and things of that sort as part of the transition process from a school environment to a work environment. What you also saw, and this is similar to the German case, is that students that were identified as being gifted, either highly intelligent or very good at athletics or very good at a particular skill, were diverted into special schools. And very often what you saw is that children were taken away from their families or local schools and sent to specialized schools, whether they were in gymnastics or science and technology or bureaucracy or law. And so the point is, you went to a school where most of the people in the school shared your interest and also had a very high level of talent. And the idea was thought as, and this idea of specialization of schools is something that you see kind of on a low level in Germany compared to the United States. I don't think specializes at all. I think if you go into any high school, they're at least trying to do the same thing, and there's not that much variation even in the electives that are offered. If you go into Germany, you have several broad tracks, but these tracks are pretty homogeneous within each track. Russia, you start to see specialized schools where you have schools that are dedicated to particular areas of pursuit. And if you went to Japan, which we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide, what you see is that individual schools don't have a lot of diversity. However, there's a diverse range of schools. And so what often happens in Japan is that you take a test to get into your high school, and the test isn't the same. It's not just testing your academic background, but your skill in a particular area that the school is specialized in. So you might have a high school that specializes in baseball, science and technology, oceanography, law. And you've seen this a little bit in New York City, where they've broken up some of the larger high schools, and they've made their high schools, at least on paper, more specialized than they have been in the past, which is the idea is that you're trying to match student interest and talent with a kind of a narrow but deeper curriculum. And the idea is that you have a choice of schools. So in New York City, if you are a student, you can go to any school, although there's some formulas about you might go to one that's local, or you need some grades to get into particular schools. But I think what happened in New York City is that because of the subway system, you're able to go to a whole variety of different schools. You don't have to go, you're not kind of set to go to one school. While what happens mostly in the American suburban schools and to the lesser extent rural schools is that you might have some things like BOCES on the side, but for the most part, the schools are catch-alls or shopping malls. But if you looked at Lakeland versus Yorktown versus Mayapack versus Somers, their educational program is very similar, which is not the case in Western Europe, and even less the case in Russia and Japan. So in Japan, not just high school, but also middle school all require an entrance examination. And I think a little more comment on this is necessary, is that in Japan, tests are not to test out of something. So we often think of tests in the United States as a way of exiting a class. So you learned a lot of material, then you take the test to prove that you learned that material. And if you pass the test, then you don't have to take the class again. In Japan, you take a test to get into something. So you often take a test to get into college, to get into high school, to get into middle school. And so there's a lot of motivation, which means if you do well on the test, you get more of an opportunity than a student that did more poorly on that test. And so as a result, it kind of changes how the approach to the test is. You want to do well in the test because it provides you choices to do something that you want to do rather than, in a sense, you see tests as an escape. One thing that also in Japan is that you'll take several classes on Western topics, much more so than you learn about global history in the United States, but you're also likely to take several of your classes in a foreign language. And if you apply to college in Japan, some of the sections of the college entrance test are likely to be in English, a second language. So imagine having to take an SAT, but you had to take part of it in Chinese and part of it in Spanish. This is pretty standard in a lot of countries around the world. A good part of the Spanish-speaking world, a good part of the Asian world takes particularly English as a second language that they start in second grade and is treated as a core academic subject. As many people know, the school year is longer in Japan. It's about 45 days longer. It's also that you don't have a long summer vacation. You have 4 semesters, but there's about 2 weeks between each of the semesters and a slightly longer period during the spring semester. The school year starts at a different time. I believe it starts in April, not September. And they go to school 6 days a week, which means you have a half day on Saturday. But that day on Saturday involves a lot of things that are less structured, meaning that you might have more athletics or gym or things of that sort, and less, let's say, going to a 6-day of academic classes. But what happens is you don't have as big of a gap between semesters, and what happens is that you don't have, like what happens in the United States is that kids go off for the summer and then they seem to forget a lot of what they learned the previous year. And as a result, students in the United States spend about the first month and a half reviewing what they learned the past year that they seem to have forgot or fall back on during the summer. And one reason why Japan particularly is ahead in mathematics compared to the United States is that they don't have this kind of lost time that they have to review and reinforce because the gaps between, like, the summer vacation is nowhere near as long. Another thing that's very common in Japan is that you have a homeroom teacher, an assistant homeroom teacher, and they're a little bit like guidance counselors in addition to being teachers, and they're responsible for their core 20 or 30 students, probably more like 30, 35 students in their class, and they will call home, they will review your grades with you, and very often what they'll do is they'll visit your household, which means your parents will host your teacher, your homeroom, not all your teachers, but your homeroom teacher, and they'll have a discussion about you at your home. And so kind of like in the United States where parents come and see the teachers on the school grounds, what you see is that over the course of a year, the teacher visits the parents and they kind of trade notes. But here's another key thing about that is that I talked about it seems like they're working more, they're doing more days in school, they're not having as long of breaks. But one thing that's different, because there's kind of the perception that Japan is a highly structured society where everyone is very regimented, students own their classroom space, which means that when the bell rings in a Japanese school, the students don't go to another class, the teachers rotate. So basically you spend your class with the same group of people for the entire year and often over many different years. And so the classroom does not have the teacher's posters on the wall, or they don't have a designated teacher's desk that is kind of belonging to the teacher. The teacher does not have a say in how the classroom is designed. And so it's a lot more sparse, and there's a lot more, let's say, things on the wall or technology in the room, because each classroom is supposed to be used by all the teachers, except for some things that require specialized equipment, such as a science lab or a gym or cooking or flower arranging that requires some more specialized. But basically, all your academic classes happen in that space. The classroom is much larger than an American classroom, and very often you might see a teacher come in and just write on the board self-study, meaning like use this time to basically study hall, and the teacher will walk out and not really supervise the students. But at the same time, because the students own that classroom space, they take the chairs down, they put it up, they clean the room at the end of the day, and as a result, they don't deface the room quite as much as American students, which means they don't put gum on the bottom of the desk because that's going to be your desk. They don't write on the desk, and if you look into a Japanese school, it would seem very orderly and very clean. But part of that is because it's ownership that's put onto the students, that they're proud of their classroom, and that becomes the basis for their social activity. One last point, the United States is really the only country in the world where sports are integrated into the school, which means it's hard to imagine an American high school that does not have 12 to 20 different sports teams going on, varsity sports teams going on, and probably freshman and junior varsity levels in most of those cases. Most other countries do not have sports as part of the school, which means you don't have this thing where you're eligible for a sport because you get a certain grade in a class, and that the school determines your eligibility for the sport. It also means that what often happens is that high schools in other countries do not have elaborate campuses where they have sports fields and basketball courts and a large gymnasium. They're much more that the idea that your physical education is exercise rather than playing a sport. And they're both good and bad things about that. And it's not to say that the kids don't do team sports, it's just not organized by the school. It is organized by a club or by the town. And so that there's less liability, there's less insurance issues, but also that I think you wouldn't have something like homecoming because rituals that surround like varsity sports teams are just not crucial to what school is in most countries, and as a result, you have a lot more school buildings that are just buildings without really campuses. And to the extent that you have, like for example, in a Japanese high school, what is the gym is often dual purpose with an auditorium, and they're much more likely to exercise outside, and their gym class is much more likely to be like organized, more like when you go to like a gym like Club Fit or Planet Fitness, than it is that you're competitively playing a team sport or even something like two people playing against someone else, like in terms of like badminton or something of that sort. So I think it's very important that the United States is very much the exception in that. And to the extent that maybe there's a problem with American education, that sometimes we don't identify what really is different about American education. So what are some contemporary approaches to education that have some purchase among different groups of people around school? The first one is what I would call conventional education, which is a direct instruction approach. I think you see this very largely still at the college level, where it's a teacher-centered approach that is characterized by the teacher telling you things, and then the students repeat them, study them, master them, and then are assessed at the end to see how well they learned like the text. And I think this goes back to the Middle Ages, and the word lecture literally means to read. And it went back to, in the Middle Ages, what universities were, which is that there were very few books. And so what would happen is that only a few professors actually owned these classic books that had, scholarship and wisdom in them. And so what they would do is that the teacher would open the book and just read the book, and the students would take notes, which would be kind of their way of, summarizing the book. And just to give you one classical example of this, that most of what we have that is attributed to the philosopher Aristotle from ancient Greece is not actually something he wrote. What we have, which is usually when we say Aristotle's Politics or Aristotle's book on ethics, are the lecture notes of his students. And they've been kind of put into book form through editing, but if you ever read Aristotle carefully, you will see kind of like margin comments where, Aristotle makes an aside or a joke as like that you might see in a lecture, just going on to an example and breaking the train of thought. But you also see little like margin notes made by the students, kind of like definitions in the side of when you take your notes down when you're listening to a teacher. And so this has been around for a very long time. And then in some types of schools, particularly I think Jesuit high schools, Jesuit mean Catholic high schools of the Jesuit order, and even like in West Point, where it's very common to still carry out instruction with chalk, this teacher-centered approach is still quite powerful and has a lot of advocates for it. I think, though, it really depends on the quality of the teacher, that a direct instruction approach, the quality of the teacher and the intelligence of the teacher and what the teacher knows can either make or break the class, where you need a better teacher to teach a good direct instruction approach. So teacher quality matters a lot more, and maybe not as important to the other two approaches that I'm going to discuss. The second one is something that kind of builds on Piaget, and the idea is that the mind develops over time going through stages, and that what happens is that the teacher is guiding the student through from stage to stage, which means that when you're in elementary school, you're doing simpler things, in your middle school, a little more complicated, and as your mind grows, you're getting more and more complex presentations of similar material. But still, the idea is how your brain is processing this. So, for example, there are many subjects where you kind of do the same thing over and over again. So in mathematics, you go from simple operations, meaning arithmetic, subtraction, division, multiplication, with fewer digits to more digits. But basically, you're doing the same thing. It's just getting more complicated as you're able to handle larger and larger and more complex problems. But also something like U.S. history, which you learn in middle school, but it's a little bit watered down. You might take it again in high school. It's a lot more detail and a lot more onus put onto the students to learn the material. And then you might take American history, same class in college, that is going to be reading probably less reliant on the textbook and more reliant upon like topics chosen by the instructor. I would say the most popular one, although I think it's waning at the moment, is kind of what's called a constructivist or social constructivist approach. And this builds on kind of the perspective of Vygotsky, which is the idea that individuals create understanding, create knowledge through their interaction with their environments. And the idea that knowledge is very much applied and through learning through experience, and that the way that a classroom should be is a lot of inquiry learning, a lot of applied, a lot of projects, a lot of things that allow the student to put their signature and put their stamp onto the work provided, rather than, in a sense, reproducing the instruction as provided by the instructor back to the instructor. So there's going to be, in a constructivist classroom, the emphasis is going to be on that the teacher is just kind of moderating, it's not taking a major role, and that it is the student in conjunction with their peers who are creating meaning and knowledge. So the idea here is that when you're sitting in a classroom and you're just listening to the teacher, this means you don't question your knowledge, you become more passive, you become less of a critical thinker, and so you want a classroom where there's more discussion, particularly discussion between students rather than discussion that is going one way from the teacher to the class. So, I mean, I think there is a lot to this. I've also heard a perspective and some research that actually a CEO of a media company said that actually boring teachers promote more creative students, because what happens is that if you're always like having to be engaged and your mind is always having to work, it's basically too focused in, and as a result your mind has to constantly work, and it's like kind of you're in a pressure situation, and if you just in a sense let your mind wander and kind of like the teacher's boring you, so you look out the window, your mind actually gets a little freer, kind of like when you take, if you're like a gardener, you're just letting the soil settle, you're not in a sense using it and draining it all the time. And so the argument is that actually that direct instruction might actually foster that, not because it's the purpose or the intent of direct instruction, but by, in a sense, allowing students to get bored and to kind of let them, let their mind wander, might actually have some positive aspects. And so the emphasis here, and as the American Psychological Association, is that instruction should be moved away from a focus on the teacher to a focus on the student, and so particularly more on not what the teacher wants to convey, but more what the student wants to learn. So I mentioned before that the social policies that people try to use the school as, and because schools are everywhere, as a way of solving a variety of different problems. Racism, bullying, inequality, hunger, like through school lunch programs. And so what's happening is that, a lot of these broader kind of approaches to reforming society, school is, let's say, the battleground, or school is, let's say, the arena by where these changes are occurring, even if they're maybe not tied to the central role of schools, which might be in the sense of developing skills or educating children. So you see this where people want to, for example, one big thing is about STEM. The idea that other nations are doing better at science and mathematics than we do, and therefore we need to expand STEM courses and STEM opportunities in the school. You have things where if you think people are too competitive, then you need to work with more cooperative groups in the school. People that want more authority are about giving teachers and principals more authority, and in a sense disempowering the students and parents from having a say over decisions made in the school. More training for teachers, because If you think that kids are being delinquent or kids are kind of out of control, maybe it's because teachers are not trained to deal with the middle grades, the middle school grades, because there's no specialized training, even though it's very often a very different environment. People who are worried about obesity will focus on more physical fitness, whether health education or whether more exercise being built into the school curriculum. So there's a lot of different things, even engaging parents, using schools as a way of getting parents involved in their children's lives more than they would before. But the point here is that school is more than just about education, because people see school as a way of changing the next generation, and by changing the next generation, by changing things in the long term, whether it's a concern with things like in the environment or the economy or and this harkens back to the idea that the justification for school was to raise citizens who could participate in a democracy. And therefore there was a lot of, let's say, that certain things, that school wasn't just about learning skills and then what you do with them is your choice. They had a clear idea of what kind of people they wanted to develop, and in a sense molding them into that. So a few last things. School size, just, the idea of, like, should schools be larger or smaller? So we have high schools that have thousands of students, and we have high schools that have, in this area, that have 40 or 50 students per grade, such as Haldane and Cold Spring. And you have large high schools like Monroe Woodbury that have 3,000, 3,500 students. So one thing is just the size of the overall building, and this is kind of the same thing with colleges, that you want to go to a small college where you feel you're not going to get lost in the mix, versus a large college that might have more resources because of the return to scale. The other thing is about how large the classroom should be, and there's debates about this. Most of the countries that are performing better than us have more students in their classrooms, so a typical Finnish or Japanese classroom will have something like 30 to 40 students in it, and they get very high results. And then, if you go to a private school, one of the things that they often advertise is how small the classes are. So there's a private school very near me that one of the first things they advertise is that their class size is 8 students per class. And if you want to have more discussion, and if you want to have more in-depth, you might want to have fewer students in the class, because more people have an opportunity to participate in every single lesson. And so there's, particularly the Gates Foundation has put a lot of money trying to create smaller classroom sizes by hiring more teachers or expanding the building that we're in. The second thing where you see this is kind of classroom climate, and this kind of parallels what we talked before about the 4 styles of parenting. There's 3 styles of classroom management that correspond to 3 different styles of parenting. What you're not seeing here is kind of an indifferent style, and mostly because schools being paid to raise children are not allowed to be indifferent or disengaged from managing their children. So you have the authoritative thing, and this idea is to make the students more responsible and mature, to have more ownership over their education. There's a lot more give and take between the teachers, where I'm not telling you something, I'm asking you a question, and then you're going to, in a sense, work it through in your own mind in dialogue. So when you hear things about Socratic seminars, when you hear things about more cooperative learning, they're kind of in this model of authoritative strategy classroom, where the teacher is in charge, but the teacher is not, in a sense, laying down the law and using discipline and structure as a way to get to where they're going. So the idea is that there are limits, but these limits are rationalized in terms of the best interest and the welfare of the students. A more authoritarian strategy is that there's behavior and there's consequences. So there are certain rules in the classroom. If you break those rules, then you are going to be on the wrong side, and there are consequences and sanctions and punishments. And so the idea is that teachers place firm limits, and there's no exchange. You don't talk when you're not called on. You don't make side comments to your friend. The idea is that there's no responsibility, there's no ownership, and this leads to kind of a passive learner complex that, in a sense, undermines both education, but also might undermine social development. The last one is more permissive, and this might be called the free-range children idea, and you see this, it mostly comes from the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who back in the 1700s wrote a book called Emile about the idea of a one-on relationship and allowing the child to explore the world. You see this a little bit more sometimes in preschools. And the idea is that students need to be comfortable in their environment, and that some students are not going to learn the same way that other students have. And so you need to give them, in a sense, more space and more latitude, and not constantly focus on academic skills, and not to constantly focus on the presented classroom behavior. So just kind of as a final point in this lecture, I want to talk about, the stress and transitions, which means the transitions that go from middle school to high school and from high school to college. In the past, the idea is that these transitions were not that bad, that people did not feel like, oh my God, my world is ending, or oh my gosh, everything's going to change and I'll never see these people again. And I think people saw it as a time of growth. And so a lot of the things that mark transitions, whether graduation or prom, were important, but not as, let's say, essential as they are seen, I think, today. And so you saw lower levels of depression, less delinquency, and during these transitions, you saw more growth. What you're seeing today, particularly in college freshmen, is that there's a lot more stress and depression than in the past. And I think a lot of this is that the message being sent to students from they're young is that you can't fall behind. If you fall behind, you'll never catch up. If you never catch up, then you're going to be a failure for life, and you have to hit your marks. And so what I think there's less idea of being free to explore and free to learn or to take advantage of opportunities. And I have so many conversations with students today that students are foregoing opportunities because someone has told them that this is going to hurt their academic progress or hurt their future, whether it's being told not to play a sport that they enjoy because they want to focus on a different sport. I had one student who told me that she stopped playing piano because her parents emphasized that she had to do better in her classes, and so the one thing she was really passionate about disappeared for her life, and it said it made learning less fun, and as a result, it just became like a job. And I think that's increasingly, as you see a more competitive world and a more, let's say, more depending upon gaining credentials, and the fear of falling behind is a lot more than it was because you need to make money, have a job, and that the failure of not hitting these points on time means that you might not catch up. And I think that message is unfortunately being transmitted, and I would say even more unfortunately, it might actually have some truth. So some concluding thoughts about what the mission of our schools are. And I think that the key thing here is that schools either have a substantive mission, like this is why we have schools, because we want to have good workers, we want to have good citizens of democracy, and therefore there's a clear idea of what schools are producing, which means schools are not neutral, schools are trying to accomplish a certain outcome that is socially decided upon. And so there's a kind of that means that success for schools is by making adolescents and turning them into a particular type of an adult. The other way of looking at schools is that schools are about neutral. They're not supposed to, in a sense, shape or mold their children. They're supposed to give them skills, to give them more opportunities to determine their future and to remake their future the way they want to do it, rather than, in a sense, having an idea of what a good adult is and making the student that. It's more about giving the student the capacity and the potential to become the adult that they want to on their own terms. I think this is a debate that ongoes in school, but also about what do we want, what is society, what do adults want to do to adolescents? And I think there's kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth. So rather than give you a conclusion on this, it's just when you look at these ideas, and when we talk more about some of the social problems about bullying and dropout rates and among adolescents, whether these should be considered choices by adolescents that might not be good choices, but the point is that these choices belong to adolescents, and therefore the school should not be pushing too hard on it, versus that the school should care about how adolescents are developing and take a more active role in trying to, let's say, bend the curve to achieve those goals. So that's all for this video lecture. I will see you next time, and we'll talk more about some adolescent problems in the school environment, as I said, high school dropout rates, delinquency, and bullying. That's it. Have a good night.